So basically, I'm going to talk about two successive reports I've written for CASE. And obviously, one's been covered by John Galloway already. So they've both been published over the past 18 months. So that first one you've heard about looked at high spending on management, comparing the multi-academy trust sector to the situation in local authority maintained schools. And we did this through an extensive trawl of hundreds of academy trust accounts and also the accounts of England's largest local authorities. So I think John's presented some figures on that already. Perhaps the standout one for me was we found that the 50 largest academy trusts were spending 8 times more per pupil on salaries of £130,000 and over than were England's local authorities. So that's looking at, across the 50 trusts against the 10 largest local authorities in England. And then the second report I've done for CASE was actually just published yesterday. So it sought to interrogate extensive data sets from the DfE and from a freedom of information request I did to the DfE. And to answer this question, was there higher spending on management in maths accompanied by lower spending at classroom level? So we've done the first report and it kind of, you could see the higher spending on management and you think, well, that money must have to come from somewhere. So does it come from, are academy spending at less in classrooms? And the answer to that basically, as extensive data draw, was yes. The academy sector seems to be spending more on management and less on classroom teaching and education support staff per pupil than does the LA maintained sector. So breaking that down, academies have slightly higher pupil-teacher ratios than do LA schools, with ratios higher still within the biggest academy chains. Classroom teachers are paid less on average than those in academies than those in LA schools. And a lot of these tendencies were particularly pronounced in sponsored academies. So these are schools usually taken over by an academy trust following an adverse Ofsted report. So teachers in sponsored academies were paid £2,000 less on average than those in LA schools. So you look at that and you think the solution to that might be seen to be national pay and conditions for all. But although academies don't follow national pay and conditions, there is no national pay and conditions arrangement for senior management within academy trusts. But for classroom staff, they do, most of them I think, tend to follow national pay and conditions arrangements. So it's not as if academies are spending less on paying people less for doing similar jobs to what they would be doing in the local authority, or staff with similar levels of experience being paid less for what they do. Rather, it's academies' lower spend on pay seems to come from the differences in the workforces in the two sectors. So those in academies and in sponsored academies in particular tend to be younger, with the proportion of teachers aged under 25 being almost 50% higher in sponsored academies than in LA schools, with the former having a workforce overall in sponsored academies which was 2 years younger than in LA schools. There's also a higher rate of teacher turnover, teachers leaving schools in academies and in the big academy chains in particular than in the LA sector. So some chains had 1 in 3 teachers leaving their schools in the recent year I analysed, that was 21-22, compared to an LA average rate of 15 to 16%. So, and a higher proportion of teachers working in sponsored academies do not have qualified teacher status. So it's 4% in primary sponsored academies compared to 1.8% in local authority schools, and 4.5% for secondary sponsored academies compared to 2.9% in the local authority secondary academies. That's teachers without qualified teacher status. Okay, so surveying all these statistics, it is possible to wonder why it is that one set of schools, academies and multi-academy trusts in particular, have been favoured over the other by governments, but that is the case. To summing up, academies and multi-academy trusts in particular have higher teacher turnover, lower teacher pay, higher pupil-teacher ratios, more spent on management, lower spend at classroom levels. So for LA schools, of course, that's the reverse of this. And yet, which structure has been favoured by governments? Okay, but asked to come up with solutions for this talk. First off, I think the new government should look seriously at all of this. I mean, some of these, statistics seem to be coming through quite consistently. There was I can also think of an Education Policy Institute report which came out earlier this year, which was also identifying higher teacher turnover within the larger academy chains. And this is in the context of a serious retention situation within schools, so you could call it a crisis. And so, it's surprising that governments are not looking at this government, and well, it's not surprising the previous government. This government should, I think, be looking at this very closely and investigating the impact in full of the multi-academy trust structure, which, of course, the Conservatives put in place as their favoured model for state-funded schools in England. And findings such as the teacher turnover statistics, which can coincide with a number of teachers leaving overalls, are said to be at its highest level since 2010, I think really give pause for thought. I think questions should be asked about the top-down nature of the multi-academy trust model, with highly paid management devising policies for the workforce to follow. Is this developing professionalism or creating a culture of uniformity and compliance, which is maybe proving off-putting to a relatively lower paid and junior workforce? Is that the case? I think we should certainly look into it in detail, and among the policymakers should be doing that. Beyond that, the Academy scheme is hugely complex, and debating any possible changes here would take a lot more than I've got time for now. But central to any new approach, I think, would be about looking at the institutionalized remoteness of the policy. Rob Hyam touched on this a little bit in terms of the democratic deficit. It is institutionalized remoteness because the control in Academy Trust ultimately sits with only two parties, which is the Trust Board, which is unelected, and central government. This leaves local communities, including the workforce, on the outside. Addressing what I think its design fault, the central design fault from a public service perspective, will be the key to any truly meaningful reforms. That would entail a look at the fundamentals of this policy, which takes away the local community perspective in decision-making and arguably in its centralisation, and looking at how that can work against teacher professionalisation in favour of a more top-down model. But beyond that, the government just needs to look seriously at the detail of what is going on, because it's often not pretty.